everyone, and welcome. My name is Christine Kennedy, and on behalf of the Office of Alumni Engagement and the McMaster Continuing Education, I'd like to thank you for joining us for another talk in our Caregiving Essentials webinar series. Today, we are recognizing World Elder Abuse Awareness Day, and we're so pleased to have Laura Tamblyn Watts return today to discuss issues such as identifying and preventing elder abuse. Laura is the CEO of CanAge, Canada's national seniors advocacy organization, making her exceptionally well qualified to speak on today's topic. But before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that the land on which this webinar is taking place, I'm down on campus at McMaster University. It's located on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee Nations and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. So now it is my pleasure to introduce our host, Donna Thomson. Donna is a caregiver, author, and educator. She is the author of 2 best-selling books on caregiving, including The Unexpected Journey of Caring. Donna also facilitates our free online courses for caregivers, Caregiving Essentials, and she is a co-designer of the Creating Caregiver-Friendly Workplaces course and co-designer and co-instructor of the Family Engagement and Research course, all of which are offered through McMaster Continuing Education. And our guest today, Laura Tamblyn Watts, is returning. She is the CEO of CanAge, Canada's national seniors advocacy organization, and Canada's leading voice on aging issues. She is a lawyer, leading media commentary, corporate director, an internationally recognized expert on aging, and if she just couldn't fit all of that in, she is a professor at U of T down the road, where she teaches law and aging. And of course, many of you may remember her as the best-selling author of Let's Talk About Aging Parents, which was launched a few years ago in 2024. And she shared insights about the ideas in her book during a webinar with us in April of that year. She's also the recipient of numerous national and global awards for her work. Laura recently was awarded by her alma mater, Queen's University. She was awarded the top humanitarian honor, the Global Impact Award. She's a proud Canadian, where she divides her time. So that's out east in Nova Scotia, central Canada and Ontario, and out west in BC. So we're so pleased that she could join us today. Thank you, Laura and Donna, and I'll hand it over to the two of you.
Thank you so much, Christine, and welcome, Laura. I'm so delighted to be having this conversation with you. I mean, anytime, but especially today on World Elder Abuse Awareness Day, something I know that you are Canada's expert in this topic and a worldwide expert. And I really wanted to dive in because this is an issue that's been in the news so much recently. But first, I wanted to ask you, Laura, because I didn't get to ask you this last time. How on earth did you become interested in the issue of elder abuse in the context of becoming a lawyer? I mean, what drew you to that? Did you have a personal experience or something?
I think like so many people who find themselves in the field, you think to yourself, how did I get here? Like what was that path? And then you look backwards and you think, oh yeah, that makes sense, right?
Hmm.
I think like a lot of people in the field of aging, we were engaged in care and support with older relatives as part of my whole life. We had 6 older relatives that were part of our resourcing. So care and care support was just like kind of regular. I was hanging out with 70-year-olds and 80-year-olds back then. And it wasn't something unusual. And I think if you look at people who are in the field of aging and longevity, they'll almost always tell you about someone special. For me, it was my mother's father in particular. I thought he walked on water. And I was always involved in issues related to things like social justice issues, so women's issues and children's issues and so on and so forth. And I ran what we used to call a rape crisis center. And then it was sexual assault crisis center. I did that through university, all while volunteering with the Alzheimer's Society.
Oh.
And so I volunteered with the Alzheimer's Society from about grade 11. But having always done this work with women and children and domestic violence and so on and so forth. And then when I was in like I said, I'm still in private practice, but I was in that kind of regular private practice. I do remember one particular case, and it's often those turning points, isn't it, that changes. And this was a case where a woman, and she was in her late 80s at the time, and I was felt like 12 years old. I was a fresh young lawyer at 20, whatever it was, but, wet behind the ears. And this wonderful woman came in, and I was the cheapest person that you could hire because I was like the first year out of law school. So everybody else around me was far more expert and expensive. But I'd done work in estate litigations, and I'd done healthcare issues, and my experiences with caregiving and with domestic violence and sort of social issues, they hadn't kind of lined up and meshed. They were just different parts of things that I'd been interested in and done. And so she came in, and it was the first time I was confronted at a professional level with someone who said, I'm being abused. I'm being abused. And then, of course, in my mind, I'm thinking, oh, you're like 89. Like, what could that possibly mean? And now it's that story that we all know. It was her son. He was financially abusing her. It was trying to have her, quote, declared incapable. It wasn't that she was mentally incapable at all. It's that she wasn't giving him things that he wanted, including the money, right? And there were these power dynamics, and he'd forced her to sign documents. And in the way of interviewing, once I could sit and listen and engage, of course, you reveal these layers of abuse and neglect. And I think that everyone on this call that's been involved in working with people who've been traumatized or victimized, you know that what comes to you, which was actually her saying, I got this legal problem, financial problem.
Yeah.
It was the tip of that iceberg, right? So we needed to build trust and understand. In fact, she was, in fact, being financially abused, but she was also being physically abused. And she'd lived in a family where she herself had been a victim of domestic violence, grown old. Her husband had passed away. And at that point, the son kind of took over. And it helped me understand that like things don't end at 50 or 60 or 70 or 80, that these experiences of abuse and neglect are both often stretched across the life course, but that we simply don't talk about it happening to older adults. And I think now we've come a long way, but there's so much more, and we do so very little to support older persons who've been abused and neglected. In if you compare it, for instance, within the first year of the pandemic, we estimate that elder abuse and neglect went up 600%. Wow. 600 in Canada. 600% is the estimation. And that's not including issues around institutionalization and nursing homes. I'm talking about at home. And almost immediately, you may remember, in March and April, the federal government came out with significant packages of support, $500 million for intimate partner violence, because people know they're going to be locked up in home with people who are in very difficult situations. Similarly, about $500 million for younger persons who might be experiencing. So $500 million in each of these areas. Do you know how much money abuse and neglect got over the entire pandemic? $0. And yet there are more people who are older persons. And if we talk about the different kinds of abuse and neglect, there's arguments to say it outstrips all the other categories combined. Not that that's anything you want to brag about.
My goodness. Well, I guess I have so many questions. So the first, I'm visualizing, playing that story in my mind like a movie. And that woman must have been so brave to come forward.
Yes.
So I guess that's the first thing I'd like you to reflect on and tell us about what does it take? And we'll get into recognition and prevention and everything in a second, but just to use that story to learn from it for a minute, what does it take from an individual like your client or a family member to come forward? And how hard must it be to come forward alone?
Just to give you a sense, I've been in the field for about 30 years, and I can count probably on two hands the number of times that happened, where somebody said, I self-identify as a victim of elder abuse, and I am individually reaching out for help and support to you. Like, that's not my experience, and I think it's not the experience of many people.
Right.
it really is understanding how to recognize, how to read a situation, how to physically read the room. And we could talk a little bit about what physicality in the room or how a person may react. And to see some of those red flags, what people will come to you typically with is something that is less physical, less personal, less emotional. So financial or fraud, or just like a neglect type of thing, but it's not even I'm the victim of neglect, but I wish I could have or something. Those tend to be the ways into the conversation. And I always ask people to just sort of stop and really hear that, not to answer back as something, but to, my favorite words I'm a lawyer, but I teach in the faculty of social work because I think most issues are actually people issues. If you can afford a lawyer like that one woman, I'm somewhat less worried about you. It's everybody else, right? The 99%. If there's one phrase that I could ask people to sort of, when someone comes and approaches you with something that you think to yourself, I don't know what this is, but this is something concerning. I'm reading from the face, or I'm worried about, or I'm concerned. I'd sort of say, stop. Like, that sounds really hard. Can you tell me a bit more about that? And then shut up. And one of the things that is important to remember is that older people may take an actual longer time, not just like 30 minutes. I mean, I usually count beats that you have to wait. And that's especially true if you're dealing with a person with hearing issues or even some small cognitive issues. So I usually say, if you're a person that speaks fast, or you want to react fast, or you think that leaning in and showing that you're really listening, it may just behoove you to count on your fingers. And I usually say count to 7. And then for every decade after 60, count another one. So it feels like a long time, Donna. And so I think some people are worried about underreacting, but I usually just let people hold that space, and they will usually feel safe that you've heard them, that you're going to listen, that you're not going to jump in. But it can also take a little bit longer to cross those hemispheres of the brain, or if you've got a hearing impairment, just to process. So slow it down.
Right. That's so good. That's such good advice for every caregiver. We all know we get very good at slowing down, I think, after years of giving care. But so can you just, before we get into, recognition signs and symbols of possible abuse of many kinds, what are those many kinds? Let's just begin the conversation there somehow.
And I'll rank them in order of what's most commonly disclosed, if that helps.
Yes.
So the one that's most commonly disclosed, though they may not self-identify it as this is what's happening to me, is an emotional or sort of psychological abuse. And some people will say, well, what does that look like? It could be bullying. It could be putting a person down. It could be infantilization, being told you're too old, right? So there's that emotional abuse, and that overt ageism is part of it. It is rare that that's the only form of abuse, right? It's usually where there's one form, there's almost always another one. The second most commonly recognized one would be around a financial abuse. And if you include, specifically now AI micro-targeted frauds and scams, I don't know a single person who hasn't actually had to reach out to be abused. Like, I don't know anyone. I've had 3 this week, and I just turned 55, so yay. But it's about 2/3 family and friends that perpetrate most forms of abuse and neglect, except financial abuse. It's now about 50-50. And it's not because the family and friends one went down. It's that we're seeing a massive surge in financial abuse, really because of AI micro-targeting. We can talk a bit more about that. So financial abuse. We know that there's physical abuse, right? And so that could be bruising. And I have a whole list of things to see. Often people will look at an older person and say, oh, they bruise easily, or, she had a fall or whatever. But we actually can tell the difference between a fall or an older person who's got physically thin skin.
How do you tell that?
Yeah, Dr. Laura Mosqueda, and I'll put it in the chat, who's a geriatrician out of the United States, created a forensic mapping of physical abuse for older persons. And it's really, and she did that because so often when they were trying to do research into it, people just said, oh, no. It's like the old thing, right? Oh, she's just clumsy, or oh, she's just old, or no, we can tell the difference, right? So physical abuse is actually a really common one. I mean, it can be one time. I could get someone punched in the face. I mean, it could be one physical time. Often it's grabbing and shaking or pushing, treating purposely very roughly. I'm not talking about someone who's trying to get a person into a assistive device and they're having a hard time. No, I'm talking about physically harming a person on purpose. And I never equate children and older adults, but sometimes if you think about what would that look like, that grabbing and the pushing and the locking up and the whatever, you can think about it within the frame of child and youth physicality. It may be that you get literally punched, but it's usually some other type of holding, strangulation, often behind the neck, and so on. We think about neglect as a failure to act by someone who is supposed to be acting.
Mm-hmm.
And so I could say, oh, I'm being neglected by my cousin, but she's not really in a relationship of trust and care, or she's not really supporting to me. But by contrast, if my child is my substitute decision maker and I'm a person with cognitive impairment and they are supposed to be taking care of me, and this isn't whatever it is, and I have no food in the fridge, I've been left on the floor for 24 hours, I'm in my own feces, right? That's very much a different experience than just saying, I wish they'd visit more. It really is, it is profound neglect. And then we talk about a lot of these other pieces that I think we're going to hear more about, right? We're talking about things like institutional neglect or institutionalism. I want to start off by saying there could be fabulous long-term care, right? We can do long-term care right. We can do retirement homes right. We've got some terrific places, fabulous people trying. But then there's some places that are not so good. And this is true. And Donna, you've been a leader in so many of these areas. If you look at some of the mental health issues that we've seen for people who are institutionalized in the past, or people who have developmental differences, who've been institutionalized, you can become institutionalized. And I think folks have this idea of, what does it look like to be lining a wall of a long-term care home or some other kind of home when you're strapped into your chair in a restraint, right? It may not look like they've got you in a straitjacket, but you got a tray over you and you can't get out and you're left there for hours on end. And that's not only in a long-term care environment. As I say, there are lots of fabulous ones. You can have that same experience at home in a home care situation, right? You're left. You could be locked up, and very often those same issues of not getting your mail, not getting your email, and so on and so forth are part of that, either neglect or what we call coercive control. I had a case, I'll never forget this, where we were really worried about this one older person. And I was advising the police, and they were going in and they were trying to figure it out. And they could see, they could feel like something was wrong, but they couldn't quite figure it out. And then we started asking questions. And I said, well, did she have her hearing aids? Does she need hearing aids? Oh, yeah, no, she was really deaf. She couldn't hear us. I'm like, okay. And did she have assistive devices? Was she needing a rollator or a cane? Yeah, she couldn't easily move. Okay. And does she have dentures? Oh, well, she didn't have her teeth in. Okay. So what the abuser had done was taken her hearing aids so she couldn't hear. She'd taken her teeth so she couldn't speak. Oh. And they'd taken her rollator so she couldn't leave, right? And so that's a different thing in many cases than other forms of abuse and neglect. And it was frankly easy. Just take your dentures away. Just take your things away, right? So we have to be alive to what those kind of coercive control experiences are. It wasn't a slap in the face, but it was absolutely debilitating. So that institutionalization can happen at home as well as in a third party. And I really have to say, when you think about what's important to a person, We talk about spiritual issues, right? I'm not going to take you to temple, or I refuse to let you go and worship, or I maybe you're an observant Muslim and you're not allowed to pray 5 times a day, or whatever it is. It's really important to people's, to their values, to their souls, and so on and so forth. That same idea of keeping relationships away. So not letting you see the grandchildren is often a lever to get you to do things, right? So these types of levers of control. And I guess one of the last ones I would really kind of flag on it, I'm worried about this more now than I've been in the last few years. We're seeing a rise in chemical abuse, and it's often used as a restraint. Now, we were doing much better about that. We were really having all kinds of supports, and we're paying attention to particularly the use of antipsychotic medication as a sort of zone out drug, right? Not actually helpful if you've got dementia, mostly for antipsychotic medication. It increases morbidity by about 40%. And it's not actually what you're supposed to be using. But now we're starting to see that rise again. So that chemical abuse is something I'm increasingly worried about. So there's lots of different kinds, and they are usually layered.
So let's think about, the experiences of people listening today who may be in a position of being alone without family,
Yes.
worried about their own safety and their own potential abuse. And there may be lots of people listening today who say to themselves, well, gee, my mother lives in a city 2 hours away. How can I do my due diligence in keeping her safe? How on earth can I ensure her safety with respect to these threats of artificial intelligence, threats that are institutional, because she lives in assisted living? How do you, first of all, recognize what are there questions we can ask either ourselves or other people who might be victims? What are the words to use to be able to know, are they okay or not?
I think that's so critical that we look at the person individually. And so part of what I would say is your first level answer to that is, and it's not always black and white, I understand that, but is that person mentally capable of making their own decisions? Yes or no? Right. Because if you are a mentally capable adult, no matter your age, you are allowed to make decisions that are not beneficial. You are allowed to stay in relationships that are abusive. Now, we may not want to, and it doesn't mean we walk away. But certainly anyone who's worked in the field of any type of domestic or intimate partner violence, that it takes often many times before someone can leave, and they may decide to stay for any number of reasons. And I hope we're well past that. I can't believe she stayed. Why did she stay? Right? Like, we're well past that. It doesn't mean we can't do interventions and supports and harm reduction. There's many things we can do. But as that first step, are they mentally capable? Are they not mentally capable? Now, you and I know that that's not often just like a light switch on and off, right? Okay. And sometimes people are, you think maybe not very mentally capable, but because of the abuse and the neglect, they're not getting their insulin. They're not getting their medications. They're not sleeping well. They're too cold. They're too hot. They're not, their bodies aren't being well treated in terms of toileting, right? Or they may have episodes of delirium because they've had some type of healthcare issue and they haven't had the appropriate follow-up, right? So we need to understand, like, do we think that they're kind of wobbly, and can we make it better? Just because you think that they've got some mental incapacity doesn't mean that that's how they always have to be, right? So you can make things better. But if you are already as a confirmed substitute decision maker, and you are that person making the decision because they are no longer mentally capable, the law is super clear. Actually, you are not allowed to make a substitute decision for somebody to leave them in an abusive or neglectful situation. That's hard when we're talking family dynamics. Let's take an issue of mom and dad, and I'm going to use gendering on this one because it's much more typically still men to women. And I know that there are many genders, but I'm just going to use this as an example. So if dad is hitting mom, if dad is restricting mom's money, if dad is, sexually assaulting mom, and you are the substitute decision maker for mom, you can't let that happen. You can't just say, well, their relationship has been like that. No, it's very clear. Okay. If that person is mentally capable, then they have the right to make their own decisions. And you need to really start figuring out how to have those conversations and what's most important to them. And if it's kind of in that middle ground, you may need to figure out kind of where they sit on that. Remember, people are mentally able to make their own decisions unless proven otherwise. And so it always goes on that. So once you figure out, who's making the decisions on that one, I usually ask people to try to find a time and a place where they can have a private conversation. And I'm not being flippant when I say that. It can be hard, particularly if they don't, you've got that sun behind the potted plant, like watching every move that you take or something. If that person is in immediate distress, if they are in danger, you call 911. And I'm not overstating that. If they are in danger, you call 911. This isn't let's help to figure out what we're going to go on. No, if they are choking, if they're being hit, if they are being abused, if they've got open wounds, you call 911. It's an emergency. If we have all those red flags, there's a new best friend. There's the unsuccessful nephew who's moved into the basement, and now mom is moving in the basement and he's living upstairs. If there's a lot of lawyer visits, if you can't see mom anymore, no one's seeing her outside very much. If neighbors come by, but she's always asleep, or, every time you do get a chance to see her, she's out of it, or she's not making sense, or she doesn't have her teeth assisted devices, and so on and so forth. These are all really big red flags. And so it's very important to figure out how to have a conversation with them first. The instinct for many people is to go to the good daughter, the good son, the neighbor, the whatever. But remember, there's privacy issues at play, and they may be the abuser. That's the hard part.
Right. So I'm just looking at the chat, Laura, and, I think there is a little bit of confusion about who is this person that we're talking about if it's not immediate family, because most of the time, the substitute decision maker or the power of attorney is the son, the daughter. Most of the time, it's a close relative.
Yeah.
So if you want to, let's just use the example where you are worried about somebody that you are not the power of attorney for. So you may be another, you may be another daughter, you may be a niece, something like, but you are not the decision maker for that person.
But you're worried. You're seeing something going on. It's not right. So the first question is, can you get to see the person? And the answer may be no, right? But can you get to see that person? Can you try to have somebody else get to see that person? You need to see, are you being blocked? Mom may not want to talk to you. Sometimes we underestimate the fact that actually it may be your relationship that's problematic. What about the friend? Can the friend get a hold of somebody? So I would just say at a practical level, see if somebody else can get in, or is it nobody can get in? So that's kind of one thing. If you can see that person, you need to start doing a check. The first thing I usually say is ask to make a cup of tea. Get into the fridge, see if there's food in the fridge, go to the bathroom, see if the meds are being there. Let's see if that person, is there a strong smell of urine? If you can assess the situation, if you hear the person talking about somebody over and over, people repeat what's important to them.
Mm-hmm.
Or if they're specifically not talking about somebody that they ordinarily would be talking about. Oh, so your nephew, Matt has moved in downstairs. Oh, well, yes. Now we're going to talk about something else. Oh, that's kind of weird. Oh, so Matt is he living here? Oh, yeah, right. Okay, so if there's repeating that person and what they're doing all the time, the new best friend, the thing that's happening, this romantic relationship that they've started online, a great deal. If they're repeating it over and over again, that's a red flag because people repeat what's important to them. Or they're absolutely skittering away and being avoidant about a thing that they would ordinarily talk about. Those
Sure.
are flags.
Right.
If you are trying to figure out who's responsible, who do you call? That's one of the reasons I asked where everyone's coming from. It's a different answer in Alberta than it is in British Columbia. It's a different answer in Nova Scotia than it is in Quebec. And I'm going to put on the website, I put the Canadian Network for the Prevention of Elder Abuse in here. And in particular, I will give you the list of, it says who to call in every single different jurisdiction in the country.
Okay.
And why I say that is often people will think, oh, I'll call the public guardian and trustee.
Mm-hmm.
And in British Columbia, that's a terrific idea. Because in BC, the public guardian trustee has a mandate to investigate elder abuse. If you call them in Ontario, they don't have that mandate. And it's important to get a sense, you have to, and I know it's hard, but that's why I'll give you a list of who to call in every jurisdiction. Often people will see, oh, well, there's a network for the prevention of elder abuse in my area, for instance, right? And I know you're in Ontario. So Donna, if you are in Ontario, I would say the Ontario Network for the Prevention of Elder Abuse. But they're not first responders. They're trainers or supporters. They've got great information and so on and so forth. But it looks like maybe they're the people to call. They have great resources, but they're not the responders. So I will put the list of who it is in here as well. One of the questions that Lori is asking, and it's such a really important question, is who makes the determination of mental incapacity? Because remember, I said it depends on who. Lori, you're going to love when I answer this question. It depends on what jurisdiction you're from. Now, it looks like you're in Ontario, Lori. And so there's a couple of different ways for that to happen. The most common way is that person ends up going into the hospital. And I'm not saying that that's the best way. I'm just saying it's very common that some major event happens. They have a fall or something gets terrible or they're being neglected. And why I flag that is I always say, if you do get somebody in the hospital, ask for a geriatric consult. A geriatric consult. They have them usually, depends on where you are in the world, but geriatric consult. You're more likely to get one in hospital than not, or a referral to a geriatrician. Now, they're kind of like hen's teeth, Donna, you know that. We have about one geriatrician for every 21,000 Canadian seniors. But ask for geriatric consult at best, right? Get someone who specializes in understanding the whole person. Ideally, if the gold standard, the best of all possible terms, you would get what's called a geriatric psychiatrist, or sometimes they'll call them a psychogeriatrician. And so that's a person who is a doctor and a psychiatrist, and they have a specialty in aging. Now, there are not a lot of those, okay? The reality of the circumstance is that med schools and lots of other healthcare schools don't necessarily teach mental capacity assessment. So people who you think would be good at it, they may not have the training. Because you're in Ontario, Lori, and you asked me that, if you want to, you can hire a capacity assessor. This is unique to Ontario, and increasingly now New Brunswick is starting up a new process around this as well. And you can hire one and they're coming and they're specialized and so on. Quebec has a different version. So if you're on the other side of the river, Donna, what I would say is Quebec has got a very good integrated approach. Usually, if you're worried about a person and they're living at home, and it's what I'll call important, but not emergency, right? It's important. Mm-hmm. In almost every single jurisdiction in the country, anybody who cares about somebody can usually call a health at home. And I see here that Lori's got Ontario Health at Home, does shelter decisions and so on. But usually there's a home care assessment. The most important thing I really want people to remember is there's a difference between what we call a functional assessment and a mental capacity assessment. So one is trying to figure out, can I get up? Can I bathe myself? Can I shower? Can I cook? And that's important because if you're being neglected, someone else is supposed to be doing that for you. We need to know you have a high degree of dependency and we need to take care of that. But that's, can your body do things? A mental capacity assessment is, can you understand information and appreciate the consequences and make a decision about it? Even if it's a decision that is unwise, but can you do that? So you have to make sure that if you're calling somebody, you're saying, I'm alert about a mental capacity assessment. You may also want a functional assessment, but it's not the same thing. You see here in the chat, I think you've got lists of all the different places to call around it. Usually you can call. There's someone to call. You may need to get connected with what's happening in your jurisdiction. And some jurisdictions have better networks of support than others. What I would say is if the person is living in the home, there is an instinct to take the abused person out of the home. And that may not be the right decision. And this is where, Donna, and I mean, you talk about this all the time. If you can talk to the person, you have to ask, is there anything in your life that you wish wasn't the way it is right now? What's really important to you? If you could change something or a couple of things, what would you change? And what do you want to stay the same?
Mm-hmm.
And many people will say, well, I want to stay in my house. I just want them gone.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to see the grandkids, right? So you have to understand a little bit about what it is. Often we want to rescue that person from the environment. But if they cohabit, you may actually just want to hear what they have to say, which is, I want to stay here. I just don't want to stay here with him. Can you make him go?
Yeah. Well, it's so human, isn't it? I mean, this is all very what I would do in that situation, what I would think and feel. Laura, I want to ask you about environmental monitoring, cameras in the room, all kinds of technologies that you can monitor the activities, wandering, getting up at night. There's an app for these things. And I wonder, to what extent can we depend on technologies and how do we balance privacy? I mean, could that be a form of abuse in terms of sort of the Truman Show, I mean.
Yeah, that's great. And I see that one of the questions is really around this as well, which is super helpful. I'm actually a big fan of technology. And that's why I want to say what's most important to that person. What is most important to you? And we often have this very strict black and white idea of complete autonomy and complete independence. We all sort of live this individualistic life and nobody helps us do anything. And it's just frankly, it's mostly not true. And what I would offer is most older adults have a sense that there's some playoffs that you need to have. And what's most important to you? If it's most important to you that you live alone in your home, and you have your garden and you stay in that street, in that building, then you may say, okay, here's some possibilities of what we can do. We can get different kind of care in. We might need to pay for some things. How about we get some cameras in here? We have floors that if you fall have sensors in them. We can put air tags, kind of all kinds of different places if we're worried about wandering. There's better ones than air tags, but air tags are one people often know about. I can mount a big iPad and we'll do a daily check-in. We can do some tech meds management. If you've got diabetes, maybe you share. If you've got one of those Insta-read diabetic things, maybe you share that to me. Like we talk about what's more important and what will you accept. It's interesting because talking about privacy and confidentiality and who knows what is one of those evolving areas. And people often are more okay with having some information shared if their big needs are met, right? So you say, well, if you can't do this, then you're going to have to go into either shared housing or long-term care, or maybe move to a smaller community. You'd be like, well, okay, I will do that. The other piece is, what do you want to have happen in the case of an emergency is an important conversation to have. And it doesn't sound like an elder abuse conversation, but it can be very revealing, right? People say, well, I don't call my son. You're like, oh, okay. So that's a piece of information. Why? What is it you want to know? Well, he's trying to put me in a home, or he thinks I can't live here or whatever. So you understand it. Maybe it's not abuse, but maybe there's some degree of concern around that one. What I would say is I think the technology can do a lot. for people. And there's new and evolving technologies that lots of people don't know about. And I'm going to put information, I'm going to put in the chat AgeWell, which is the Network of Center of Excellence on Aging and Technology, and lots of free resources. And you're very networked as well, Donna, with it as well. There's a lot of great things that are out there, lots more things than people think there are. But we can take technology and make it empowering. An Apple Watch or something like that does so much that we don't use. Heart monitoring and so on and so forth can happen. So I think it plays an important role. The average distance for an older person to a younger care supporter, if they have one, so I'm talking generationally, in Canada, if you're in the same jurisdictions, 400 kilometers. If you're out of jurisdictions, 2,100 kilometers. So technology is going to have to play a role. Financial supports with technology, like paying bills and those types of things you can do remotely. It is important, though, to try to have someone to see that person every so often. And that's where that conversation around care and support. But increasingly, I'm worried about solo seniors. And that was one of the questions as well.
Right. I wanted to ask you about that. So there were two questions in the chat that I wanted to ask about. One is if if you install cameras in your senior's own home, or even the family installs cameras in a room in a long-term care facility, do you need to disclose that? What is the legal obligation to disclose?
It's a fuzzy area of law is the reality. It's a fuzzy area of law. My recommendation is that you can put a camera in if you are the person that lives in that room, or you are their valid substitute decision maker. You can't spy on somebody without their knowing. So if, let's just say, dad is mentally capable, you're like, I just want to watch to see how he's doing. No, you can't put a spy cam in on your dad if your dad's mentally capable without his permission. He can say, sure, no problem, put it in. That's fine. That's a different question. You can get consent. If you're the legal substitute decision maker, dad doesn't have the mental capacity to make that decision, and you are that correct person, I recommend no audio. Many places, if it's a workplace as well, you've got workplace issues in addition. It is, I think, an increasingly common thing. Even people have like those Ring doorbells and so on and so forth. So this is an area home care workers are now increasingly having to pay attention to, where before it seemed to be much more limited to retirement homes and long-term care facilities. But as cameras are there, my recommendation is disclose, certainly not in bathrooms.
Right, of course. Yeah. But what happens to somebody in institutional care who is alone, does not have a decision maker, does not have, well, maybe they have capacity, maybe they don't, but what, if any, guardrails are in place to prevent, recognize, and deal with situations of elder abuse in that case?
Yeah. In some cases, I actually worry less about people who are in institutional or long-term care than I do at home, because within congregate regulated entities, there are requirements all across this country. So it's slightly different requirements and it's slightly different pieces of legislation, but in everything that's got congregative hands-on housing plus care, particularly that kind of 24-hour nursing home environment, it is a highly regulated environment. Now, it doesn't mean that there's not other kinds of risks and challenges and so on, but all across the country, elder abuse and neglect has sort of a zero tolerance, and there's requirements and reporting and so on and so forth. And ideally, people who have training and somebody to roll up to. Having said that, they are also massively understaffed. The resident-on-resident issues are real, particularly where you may have people who have behavioral responses. It's not elder abuse, it's something else. Well, a person it's violence, right? It's aggression, it's violence. I mean, whether a person mentally means to do it, that other person is still unsafe, right? There's a lot of complicated issues around that. But in many cases around elder abuse and neglect, I kind of worry less around those regulated environments because there's people there. I worry a lot at home, because this is where people can get left on floors. This is where people can have no one visiting them. This is where the reality that the StatsCan report that came out in 2018 that found that 1 out of every 5, so 20% of Canadian seniors, not just those in really advanced years, but like 65 and over, 20% of Canadian seniors do not have a single person to reach out to, even in the case of an emergency.
Mhm.
Let that sink in. And so this is where those networks of support and networks of care and community, like we really got to reach into them and be purposeful. Yeah, 20% of Canadian seniors, it was as of, I think it was August the 2nd, 2018, a StatsCan report came out. Do not have a single person to reach out in case of even an emergency. That number is going to get smaller again because of the population aging. So you may not have started off as a solo senior, but you may have outlived everybody.
Mhm.
Or you may have known everyone on your street, but then the street changes over and now you don't know people. So it's
Yeah.
not just only people who never had anyone in their lives, it's people who find themselves in that circumstance. Right now, you can hire a trust company. So if you go to a financial institution and you're like, I want to ask, I'm not advertising for anybody, but any financial institution that you go to probably has a version of it that says trust afterwards. So RBC Trust, TD Trust, Scotia Trust, continue on for all the financial institutions. And you can make an arrangement and have them be your substitute decision maker for financial matters. Now they take a little percentage point, but not actually as much as you'd think. We don't have anyone in Canada. Our laws do not allow you to hire someone to be your substitute decision maker for your health and personal care issues. And this is something that we're going to have to confront. In theory, it ends up being the public guardian and trustee, or if you're in Quebec, a public curator. In some jurisdictions, it's a public trustee or a public guardian, but some version of the public guardian trustee. And they are so under-resourced and they have giant mandates. And we're really going to have to think about this. So increasingly, I ask people to think amongst their friends. They may not think about it as that traditional family or biological family, but do you have somebody else that you can say, well, I'll do it for you if you do it for me? And like those types of conversations, those book clubs.
Yeah.
That tennis team, that whatever it is that you have, maybe you start having these conversations because often people do not have that traditional family or don't want their kids involved or their nieces or nephews or godchildren involved. They want somebody else. They don't have a good relationship.
Yeah, this is a discussion that certainly in the disability community, after parents die,
Absolutely.
and they have a child with developmental disabilities, the huge fear is that adult child will be very isolated, very open, prone to being abused in all the ways and means that you've just reviewed. So those networks of support, so that if there is a living family member, maybe that family member can have a network of support. So there are these concentric circles of eyes on and contact with, which in itself are reporting mechanisms and mechanisms of accountability.
They really are.
Yeah.
And I one of the ways that we can start that conversation, this is really prevention, right? Start that conversation is to ask what would happen in the case of an emergency, as opposed to what would happen if I had dementia or what would happen if I was in long-term care. Just start off with like, what if I fell and broke my leg and I couldn't drive and I live in the country and I don't know how I get food and I don't know how I get transportation and I don't know how I get to doctor's appointments. Like, what would you do if, and then just think about a slip and fall, or you think about if you want. I had a very active person and they never wanted to think about anything bad as in terms of aging. And I was like, okay, what if you were on that silent yoga retreat in Tibet you were going to, and you fell off the mountain or you bent the wrong way? And that helped them think about it, not in terms of catastrophic age, which they were very afraid of, but just like, who would I call? What would your plan be? And what we know is that emergency plan is a really good starting off point for an ongoing plan, but doesn't often have that panic attack. And when you're thinking also, people say, well, it needs to be the family or a family. Listen, most people have a hard time with their families and they may not want them involved at all. I love my kids. I have 3 kids. Would I make any of them my decision makers? They're 22, 23, and 24. I don't know. No, probably not. And I would be looking to a peer much more. And people forget that if you're trying to figure out who you have conversations with, particularly older persons, they have conversations with their peers. They don't usually go down generations if there are generations to go to. So yeah, I think it's those important kind of collectivities. And then at some point you're going to have to be like, all right, well, can I get them to call you or can you call me? And then that emergency planning might become longer term planning.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And you also wrote that in your book too, because I remember reading it. And I highly recommend your book. It's just fantastic. Um, can I just ask you one question? I know we're nearing the end, which drives me crazy because I just have so many more questions, and I know everybody does. I am wondering, in these stories are coming out of the United States, and my question for you is, could this scenario ever play out in Canada, where a public guardian
Yeah.
eyeballs a solo senior who has assets
Yeah.
and goes in and um, declares them incompetent, takes all of their assets, and suddenly the senior finds themselves in having lost everything and in long-term care. Is that a scenario that is possible in Canada, or is that only a function of allowable in some way, shape, or form in the state of Florida, for example?
Yeah, that's a US thing. And I mean,
Okay.
that movie, that We Care a Lot or whatever, was a great prompt for that conversation. The
Yeah.
Americans use the words public guardian, but it's a totally different thing. It's like I'm saying pizza and you're saying apple. They mean an individual lawyer who makes money by representing. And there's some really good ones, and then there's some shady ones, as you can imagine. No, we have our public guardian trustee. We have a very social governmental response. It may not be who you want. Also, when it comes to default decisions, so if you get hit by a bus, God forbid, and you're taken away and you're unconscious, every jurisdiction's got a default list about who to call. Now, it may not be that you want that person to call, and it's a slightly different list in different places. I'm in BC today, so grandparent and grandchild and even a close friend is on the list in BC. Ontario, as an example, has a very old-fashioned, almost sort of kind of blood kin style, and it's kind of who you'd expect in that regard, not very broad, but any other relative is there, but a friend is not there. What people do not realize is there's no default substitute decision maker for finance. So if you get hit by that same bus, there'll be someone to make a decision for you about your surgery
Right.
once you're stabilized, but there's not going to be anyone to make a decision about your finance. It's not your spouse. It's not your kids. It's no one. You can't even pay that bill if you have the utilities in your name and not your partner's name. It actually ends up going to the public guardian and trustee. And that's a big shock to people. There's reasons for it, but it's a big shock to people. And so when I say, that what if planning is really important, it's an emergency, but it also helps you in your longer term. So if people say, well, if I was going to make one of the 3 documents, a power of attorney for your body, which in different names, different places, representation agreement in BC, it could be a personal directive, health directive, it could be a mandat in Quebec, but it's same kind of thing, or a financial one, or a will, I was like, wow, there's laws about what happens to your money and stuff when you die. It may not be what you want, but there are. And there's a default for who's going to make a decision for you about your body. It may not be who you want, but there is. But there's no default for finance. So that enduring power of attorney, Ontario calls it a continuing power of attorney. Quebec calls it a mandate, a mandat. That's really important. It is, however, a sword and a shield. It protects you because you've chosen someone you trust, if you have someone you trust. It doesn't protect you because also people often get you to sign them, or they get you to forge them, or they get to do it. And those are often ways that people take your money. And those can be active while you're still mentally capable. So you really have to be paying attention to some of those things that you can do to keep yourself safe for financial planning, and are also some of the same tools that can harm you. And that comes in so many ways down to that checks and balances that we need to have in our systems to be paying attention to those red flags. Now we're getting better at them because of automation, but we still need to be paying attention to them because they're really escalating.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the checks and balances is so key. So if you're thinking, for example, of making a mandate a power of attorney for money, finance, material goods, etc., then have somebody else look at it, make sure that it's not something that's done in the shadows. Um, and even if it's your lawyer or your banker or your brother, but the more people I think we have looking at what is going on with this person and everything they have and their body and their safety. Well, we know that people's people's relationships are what keep them safe,
It
right?
can be, yeah, it really can be. And this is one of those areas where it's really important to remember that there's a lot of privacy as well. So if they feel safe to have those conversations, then they should. If you can afford a lawyer, that's my number one stop, right? Because they work for you and they have only your obligations, and they will always make sure they take care of you. Or it could be a paralegal or a notary. That's my highest recommendation. I know not everybody can afford to do that. It is really important, though, that you do those what ifs. What would happen if, and do I have any concerns? And remember, you know, some people don't have a lot of people to choose, right? And starting that conversation can be hard. And that's why I in my book, I literally put different conversation prompts around how to have it. I've been putting in the chat, as we wrap up, a whole bunch of different pieces that I hope folks can have a look at. Indicators of different kinds of abuse and neglect, indicators of physical abuse, indicators of emotional abuse, financial abuse, psychological abuse, and other types of supports and other barriers that victims may have. Please remember that that one woman that came to me in the office, again, that's such an unusual experience. You really have to meet people where they're at, understand that cultural norms, stigma, shame, are all play huge roles, fear, embarrassment, and you're talking about people's bodies and their money. This is very, very personal. It's as personal as it gets. So
Yeah.
asking people again, is there anything that you really love about your life you want to stay the same? Are there any things that you'd like to change? Is there anything that's worrying you right now or making you feel less safe? And how would you, in the best of all possible worlds, how would your life be? And how can we do that? Starting from those types of appreciative approaches lets people feel comfortable. And remember, don't just jump in to answer. My favorite phrase, that sounds really hard. Can you tell me a little bit more about that and what how you're feeling about it? Listening and being active, as we know, is one of the most important things you can do to be safe and to bring up these conversations to help destigmatize abuse and neglect. Bring it to your book club, bring it to your activities, bring it into these areas, get people to talk about it. Because what we also know is, and we have really good data on this one, the more we talk about things like abuse and neglect, particularly around financial abuse and family violence, the more people actually are safe.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Laura, thank you so much. What a rich conversation. And we could go on. It's just, I really feel like I said this the last time you were here, but I think we need to get you back again
I would be
because
delighted. World
it's
Elder Abuse
just,
Awareness Day was created by Dr. Elizabeth Podniak 20 years ago. So this is the 20th anniversary of World Elder Abuse Awareness Day. It's a UN dedicated day, and people are engaged in things all across the country today. And I put the information at the Canadian Network for the Prevention of Elder Abuse in the website, CNPEA. And there's probably local activities that are happening in your jurisdiction, in different cultural centers in different parts of the country and around the world. So get involved and spread the word. And thanks for attending.
thank you so much.